Paul Griffiths has got a good question about slightly different topic, I guess. What part does the concepts espoused about our First Peoples farming of soils, you know, a la Bruce Pascoe and Dark Emu and things, play in your present-day consideration of soil health in Australia? It's a good question.
That is, in that I know nothing about what they've done. Most of my historical studies have taken place on the Hebrides or in northern Scotland with Pictish and Celtic types approaches, and then moving through to the Roman and the Norfolk forecourse. So I'd need a bit more on that, I'm afraid.
Okay, so if Paul, you want to, if you're still online, maybe add a little bit more in the comment stuff. I think there's I've only read the first couple of chapters of that book, but there's stuff around the First Peoples having a more ecological approach, I guess, in managing the land so that it supplies them the food and fibre and stuff that they needed. But I might leave that and see if...
well, I mean, I guess, yeah, I was going to say, there is that idea, I get... we farm by being stationary and transient. Our societies now exist by being stationary and transient. And I know I was speaking to a former colleague and friend recently who represents one of the nations of this country. And we were talking about Murray-Darling Basin and the lack of water flow in the Namoi. And I said, you know, traditionally, what would your people have done? He said, you're an idiot, aren't you? I said, what do you mean? He goes, well, we were nomadic. We would have roamed to a place where the water holes and the springs were. And I went, he said, it's you white fellas who've gone and stuffed us up there. And I went, okay, enough. So, because I just noticed that in the Academy of Sciences response to some of the stuff around irrigation recently, one of the things was to be more aware of the responsibility of the indigenous peoples of this country. And I was interested then to hear from them that his take was that their peoples would have moved in the past, whereas now we've made them stationary and transient by imposing westernized civilizations on them. Probably we have done very much the same with our farming.
Yeah, but there is something in that Bruce Pascoe book, and I can't remember the details of it, of them doing things that allowed them to harvest water a bit better. They were nomadic, it's true, but anyway.
Not every nation.
Paul's going to send you a copy of the book, I think.